Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast episode 14. I'm here again with Ken. How you doing, Ken?
Very well. How about yourself?
I'm also doing well. I gave myself a haircut today. Hope it looks acceptable. I have kind of a weird shaped head. I have this big sagittal crest. So if I cut it any shorter than this, like my military ID, when they basically shave it, it just looks odd, kind of like the guy who plays Picard in Next Generation. But anyway, we have in mind to talk about cultural spaces today. And also, I'm still using this new audio setup. I hope that everyone can hear both me and Ken. So let us know if there's any issue with that. But yeah, this topic is relevant to the transforming environment that we live in, the influence of cultural spaces, what a cultural space is, and when you have multiple populations, the interaction between the genetic community and the cultural community, and what a shift in a cultural community can do to genetic selective effects. So, Ken, why don't you kind of give us the layout of what you have in mind with this concept?
Well, the kind of basic real world example is if you go to a music festival and the music is your music. Let's say you're good into the polka, you go to a polka festival, you can compete socially within that polka festival. So, you can attract the opposite sex, you can make friends, whatever. If it's instead a rap festival or rap concert, you go there, you can't compete within that space. The vibes are different, the dances are different, everything. So the cultural space then determines your social worth, your social value. And given the if we assume that your social success then is going to allow you the potential, at least, for genetic biological success and finding a mate, having offspring, quantitatively and qualitatively, then really a domination, let's say, of someone who's a polka fan, who then the mainstream culture is rap music, that is an attack on their genetic worth and their ability to reproduce, essentially. And this kind of sounds out there and crazy to people who haven't heard it before. Um, Another topic that I wanted to get into that's of a similar nature is like the urban rural divide in fertility, and the way that if you put an animal in a domesticated space like a panda, you put it in a zoo, the pandas won't breed. And humans are the same way. We have a psychological environment that each person is acclimated to, that is best for their breeding. It is best for family formation. And so the psychological environment, the cultural environment, has a great deal to do with people's fertility, not just the average for society, but different subgroups, different cultural groups, racial groups within society. And so really changing the mainstream music, changing the mainstream culture actually has an impact on fertility and biology, and ultimately the dominant morality of our civilization.
Yeah, my mind goes to European colonialism and the assertion of Western norms in, I guess, the strongest example would be Japan, where that Japan might be a special case though, because they adopted Western norms wholesale. And it seems like the entire culture shifted so rapidly that you didn't have this kind of effect where you're talking about, where if an alien culture enters your space and becomes dominant, then your native genetics, which are suited to your native culture, won't be able to compete as highly. It seems like Japan was able to overcome this somehow. So it might be interesting to look at how Japan avoided it. But, high caste Indians assimilated better to the English culture that came with colonialism. What's your opinion on the Japan question then? How did Japan avoid this effect that you're talking about?
Well, it's an interesting thing. What Japan did is where they had a very small number of specialized Westerners come in as advisors, and they had, at this point, following the 19th century, they were able to create this federalized system, where previously Japan had been split into different military provinces. Now it was united under the emperor. And so they had this newfound centralization. They all spoke the same language. And it was easier to do this top down, okay, we're going to decide that Western norms are the way to go. We're going to enforce that on the population. And it's things that we don't even consider today. So when someone wears a suit, that is an expression of Western supremacy or European supremacy. The suit is a European fashion. We don't think about it that today. We think about the suit is a universal global sign that you're a businessman or you're wealthy or something. You're well dressed, but it is ultimately a Western thing. So the Japanese were able to adopt cultural artifacts, technological artifacts from the top down as an sort of an artificial designed intentional project on the part of the Japanese elite. And they did so because they saw the power of the West. They wanted to emulate that so that they could protect themselves from being encroached. Ultimately, demographically, they didn't like the idea, and they still don't like the idea of a foreign military presence coming in. We know, okay, we know from dating websites, we know even anecdotally in Japan that Asian women, in the context of, you have this Western globalism, and I think there is a genetic and phrenological and physiology part of it too. But Japanese men or Asian men generally have a very hard time competing against white men. If you had a country, let's say like the Philippines, and you have a bunch of white men going in there, they are going to more easily, they will monopolize sexual resources much more easily than Asian men. So the Japanese wanted to prevent that. They didn't want that to happen. They adopted the norms without having a demographic replacement of a bunch of white people or Europeans coming in and starting little colonies. That was attempted, but they were very much against the physical replacement of their people. Now, recently, you've had Japanese beauty contests with like half black, half Japanese women, and they're in South Korea, as an example. If you compare North to South Korea, South Korea has a lot of these Happas, these half Korean, half black, or half white people who are gaining these prominent roles in society, in advertising, in media, in athletics. If you look at the Japanese national sports team, right, we think on like the dissident right or whatever, people will talk about Japan as this ethno state. But in my mind, an ethno state wouldn't have a racially mixed team. And the Japanese national football team has one of the star players is half German, half Japanese. And he clearly, you can just look at him and tell he's not full Japanese. And it's actually interesting. You can look at that team and see all the different phenotypes that they have. What is the typical Japanese versus what is kind of this more maybe the Ainu phenotype? But it's something that is changing, and it's slow. And obviously, there's a difference between the fact that 90 or 99% of a society might be homogenous, but if the cultural idea, and this is what I'm really getting at, the cultural idea is open to globalism, it's open to multiracialism, it fetishizes people who look exotic or who are kind of half this, half that. That sets up the preconditions which are necessary for the physical change in the population.
Yeah, I've talked about this issue pertaining to mythology before, where the myth that we have, the pantheon that we set up, acts as an idealization of the types that we embody. And so, like with initiation rituals, it was the practice in many archaic societies, like the Aboriginal Australians, to, from the pantheon of spirit ancestors, kind of pick the one that you're going to identify with. And now with Hollywood, with mass media, that effectively performs the same function. So all of these Marvel films, I've noticed this, mostly when I lived in California, I noticed this. People pick a favorite superhero and they identify strongly with that superhero. I think probably the superhero films are performing more of the mythological role than maybe other types of media. Graphic novels, same thing. But yeah, I can definitely see that happening. And it happened here. It's curious because we're kind of the instigator, especially California is the instigator, Hollywood is the instigator of this shift in global culture. And yet we opened ourselves up to this kind of multiculturalism. Now we both know that it's not the founding population of this nation that got involved in Hollywood and got involved in setting up these archetypes. So maybe we don't really need to look at that case too strongly to understand what went on there and what the agenda was. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit after saying that we wouldn't. In the 50s, the shows that were coming out in the 60s, I notice a consistent trend for I don't know what to call them, what phenotype to describe them as, but the tall, dark, and handsome. So still Caucasian, but like jet black hair, dark eyes, and not like a very serious looking person. This kind of reminds me of my grandfather on my mother's side, who was an engineer. But that archetype ends up with the highly Nordic, blonde hair, blue eyed wife. This is the Brady Bunch. This is I can't remember all the names of all the like Nick at Night stuff that I watched back in the day, but that was definitely a push to transform the genetic pool. And I think it's clear, given who was in charge of Hollywood, what interest that group had in projecting this set of norms. But we can look beyond kind of the last century and these cultural transformations to ancient societies and large-scale demographic shifts, which are often brought about by cultural shifts. And before the rise of genetic archaeology, archaeologists liked to use this phrase, like pots are not people. And they would look at something like the corded ware horizon and say, well, maybe this was just these technologies were more adaptive and all of the formerly like linear pottery culture territories just decided to become pastoralist nomads, and they adopted these particular pottery styles. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this was a demic expansion out of some kind of southern Russian steppe homeland or something like that, which was more in favor in the late 1800s, that kind of way of looking at it. But even if you consider that it was a purely cultural shift, what would happen if you have a large-scale cultural shift like that and you have continuous movement of peoples, even if it's not a total replacement event? Once this new steppe culture, the pastoralist culture, is established in Central Europe, the people who happen to move that way from Ukraine will have a huge advantage. Now, clearly, we can see this today with pushing something like hip-hop culture, urban culture. Why is it that these ways of life are considered chic, considered sexy today? But I think you wanted to talk about the case of Britain, and it's had several demic replacement events, some of which were more assimilating, some of which were basically total extermination of the native population. So we're looking at first at like the Western megalithic age, circa 5000 BC, all the way up until the third millennium BC, or I guess the second millennium BC. No, third millennium BC, when you start to see the Indo-European element enter into Britain through the Celts. And this is an example, seemingly, according to the genetics that we have, of a total population replacement. There's very little of the archaic Western hunter-gatherer still in those populations, except for the portion that was actually brought by the Indo-Europeans themselves, because they were admixed. But after that point, how do you see then the interaction of the Celtic culture and the Germanic culture brought in with the Utes and the Angles?
Yeah, so when last time I think we had a bit of a dispute between people, the English versus the Germans. Some people are saying England's basically Germanic. No, England is Celtic. And I think most of the genetic studies basically tell us that really England or Britain largely is predominantly Celtic. That Celtic population came in, and that demography, that genetic cluster, that gene pool, it is the ancestral gene pool that modern day white British people are descended from, for the most part. It's not to say that there's no Germanic influence or whatever, but that is the starting point. So they have a Celtic language, then the Romans come in, and the Romans have a Latin language that influences the language. So then it becomes a infused Celtic Latin language, sometimes called Brittonic or Brythonic. And then the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes come in, and they have this Anglo-Saxon language, and then that kind of melds with the Celtic and the Latin. What sort of happens is that culturally, linguistically, a lot of that Celtic is wiped out. You can find some of the Celtic influence in certain place names or the names of rivers, but outside of Wales, Scotland, maybe part of Cornwall, really in England proper, a lot of that Celtic influence gets wiped out. The Latin influence stays because of religion, because the Roman Catholic Church, you have these holy texts in the Latin language, so all the priests are learning Latin, and
It
that
also
is in a way preserved through religion.
it also sees a resurgence in the 1700s when Latin is considered fashionable again, and actually a lot of the Latin-based words that we use today were actually invented in the 1700s, kind of like a reinvention of a lot of English academic nomenclature.
It's true, and there was also certain kings, and I'm forgetting the names. It might have been Alfred, who decided that he wanted to reinvigorate his country with the learning of Latin. And so there were certain top down decisions made to, at various points in British history, to reinvigorate society with a knowledge of Latin, because that was thought to be important from a religious standpoint or a cultural standpoint, a historical standpoint. So there were various renaissances of the Latin language. So that never entirely disappeared. Um, the the as far as these changes happen culturally, linguistically, they still did not wipe out that original Celtic substratum that has always been there and is there today. But the culture changed. So we saw, the Anglo-Saxons come in, and this is a hypothesis, but let us suppose that you have these Anglo-Saxon kings come in, you have basically a Celtic population. If they have the power to change the entire structure of the language of society, then doesn't that also suggest that they are creating a social space which is advantageous for themselves? And so even though maybe 90 or 99% of people are still basically a Celtic derived people, the upper class is going to be highly Anglo-Saxon. And there have been, I think even it was brought up in the chat last time, a lot of studies done on certain Vikings or Nordic peoples who came over, and then they have all these descendants, or like there's a clan that's especially descended from like this one guy. So if you dominate the social space, even though you haven't changed really the genetic demographics, if you dominate the space to the point where you can change the language, then it also suggests you can set up a socially advantageous space where you can be successful in the upper classes. And so this might be a reason why, even though it's universally blonde hair is universally thought of as something kind of special and it's connected with the aristocracy generally, in Britain specifically, this might lead to the idea that people who tend to have blonde hair might be more likely to be part of the upper classes, whereas people with darker hair would be more likely to be part of the lower classes. Now, this is reinforced with another wave of linguistic transformation when the Normans come in. The Normans are Romance-speaking people because they've adopted the languages of France at that time, but they're the Normans, they're the Northmen. They were Vikings who went to northern France. They adopted French, basically, but they're a Viking-descended population. They come in. And then on top of the fact that the Anglo-Saxons dominated the Celts, now the Normans are dominating these what we would call the Anglo-Saxons. So they're layer upon layer of a kind of Nordic supremacist cultural idea is superimposing itself on a demography that genetically isn't being wiped out, but it's being pushed in a certain direction. And there is this idea that, maybe if you're of this certain phenotype, you're going to be more successful because you're connected with the socially dominant group. We can also look at the case study of a place like Hungary, where Hungarians or Magyar people who live in Hungary, genetically, they are closer to Europeans than Finnish people. Finnish people who are very blonde hair, blue eyed, they do have some Asian admixture. But the demography of the Carpathian Basin was not wiped out. It's not that Asians came in and killed everyone and then started having Asian babies. It's that a very small tribe of Magyar speaking people, which is a non Indo European language, and who phenotypically probably looked more Asiatic, they came in and they were able to socially dominate the space to the point where they were able to change everyone's language from an Indo-European language to this non-Indo-European language. Now, what effect did that have practically on Hungary as a population today? It's difficult to say. There are certain mythologies in Hungary that are Asiatic in origin, that are not necessarily Indo-European. Certain aspects of that, and the political party Jobbik in recent years made the suggestion that because we're a Turkish people or a Turanian people, we should be more linked with Turkey as opposed to the EU. So, I mean, what cultural effect is that today? What's the practical effect of that? That's a little hard to parse out, but we can at least look at these different situations in which you can come in and without necessarily using violence, right? You didn't necessarily have to wipe out the people of the Carpathian Basin to change their language, but you can change the language. Now, whether or not that creates a change in breeding patterns is a different question, because I don't think there is really a huge distinction in is Hungary really more Asiatic than Poland just because Hungary speaks an Asiatic language and Poland speaks an Indo-European language? I don't think so in practical terms. But we can look, at least in theory, the way in which a cultural or a linguistic space can be changed, and that could have a genetic effect down the road.
Right. I'd be interested to look at the genetics of Hungary from right after the kind of Hunnic period. So, I don't know, when you're looking at exactly I guess the early medieval period, looking at their genetics and seeing if there's some later migration events or cultural shifts that kind of covered up that Asiatic influence. But yeah, looking back at England, another element to consider with the bringing in of a new culture, which I see a comment here that addresses this basic concept, which is Thule Fleming says hip-hop culture is popular because it targets people's more animalistic desires. So I think that can be applied to the case of the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England, because German culture was objectively more primitive than Celtic culture. Celtic culture was you had to spend years learning the higher secrets, the mystery schools of the Celtic religion. And that's one of the reasons we can't really reconstruct it, because it was such an oral tradition that had to be learned, and it was so expansive. Hinduism we know because that tradition never really died out. But I mean, Germanic traditions, it's all folklore, it's kind of decentralized, and so therefore resilient. More complex structures tend to be easier to destroy. If there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of moving parts, you eliminate one facet, and then the whole structure kind of loses its integrity. Whereas with the Germanic tradition, which is more primitive, all you need is the kind of invocation of the archetype of Thor or Odin, and it's so universal that people can just adopt it, and they don't see, in light of that, the advantages that a more metaphysically oriented kind of high esoteric Celtic tradition might have. They don't know why the Celtic religion is any better, and so you'll see a cross synthesis, and Celtic heroes being Germanized, and kind of the whole mythic framework being reworked into more of the Germanic folktale kind of saga based no, lexicon. But yeah, that's definitely happening today. More primitive cultures have an advantage, especially when this higher culture, more abstract, systematic culture isn't disseminated at the level of like your grandfather is retelling you this epic as it was in Hinduism, because the Vedas were recited, and being part of the ruling class meant learning these things, and so it was very difficult to eliminate. The Muslims coming in was not sufficient. Now, then again, India, you have millions and millions of people, even back when the Muslims invaded, and it's not quite the same when you have an island, and you have the Anglo-Saxons adopting a role as local feudal lords, effectively. And what went on there was basically they would come in and set up their manderbunds would go and raid, and they would acquire wealth, and they would ally themselves with local Celtic factions to protect them from other Germanics, and that happened with the Normans. And I think you can also draw a parallel with what's happening today with urban culture, where white liberals will adopt this kind of urban identity, multicultural identity, and that is a form of protection, like shielding them from accusations of racist or whatnot. So also I had one more note on the blue eye, blonde hair question. Like, that's replicated itself several times in Scandinavia, in England. I think that I saw a recent genetic study saying that blue eyes and blonde hair expanded rapidly over the last 1,000 years in England. So it was selected for, and this goes hand in hand with the aristocratic replacement. It also happened in Italy. I don't remember if I said that already. But it kind of does make sense when you think of, like, if it so happens that on average blonde hair, blue eyed women are especially desired, then powerful men get them. And that then the next generation, like, there's a 50-50 well, not always. The next generation, if they're coming in, the dominant new population is perfectly like dark hair and eyed. I think this is what happened with the original Yamna, who came up through the Caucasus, the ruling caste there. So they didn't have these features. Same thing as Muslim Spain. They didn't have these features. They pick the women that have them because they just find them attractive. Their kids aren't necessarily showing it, but their kids are more likely to be in a privileged position, which means they're also more likely to pick these same people. And so by the third or fourth generation, the new ruling caste acquires these characteristics. They're resilient because you don't have endemic expansion of, and this is what I used to think, this is what a lot of people used to think of, blonde hair, blue-eyed people just being the conquering class. It's that as long as those features are in the population, the elites themselves select for them and transform themselves to match it, just based on preferential breeding. And it did happen in Muslim Spain as well. I think one of the early caliphates, or caliphs or whatever, of the Umayyad dynasty there had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he was made fun of because of it. I think there were several others as well exhibiting the same tendency. But then, yeah, you get this like cultural association with the phenotype. I'm done saying that.
Oh yeah, I was going to say that it's very easy, right? There's when we talk about complexity, the ability to destroy a complex system is easier than a primitive system being more stable in a way. Really, the only way that complexity rises against primitive pressures is that civilization or complexity has to organize itself and give itself a force multiplier so that it can overpower the inherent stability of primitive systems. What that means socially is that if we're talking about in the modern day, now we talked about the ancient examples, but if in the modern day you basically have a situation where, one guy, he might be intelligent and he might like classical music, but he can't compete socially in the mainstream space because the mainstream space is hip hop, it's rap, it's this dancing and shucking and jiving and whatever. He can't compete in that. And so what he has to do as a sort of a niche way out is, one way is you make a lot of money, and then that kind of allows you to peacock in a way, and to overcome the fact that you are not accepted in mainstream society, or you can't compete socially. You can't compete in the here and the now. There's a difference between someone who can go up to a woman and immediately impress her just with his force of personality, his style, whatever, and then someone who has to say, look at my nice house, or look at my nice car, or look at my income, or something like that, take you out to a nice dinner. So the issue that we have here is basically there is a lower class which is able to succeed in socially, because that lower class is being catered to. It is culturally dominant. We see people with the ripped jeans, pre-ripped jeans. Why? Because you want to look lower class, because to be lower class is cool in a way, and that has a racial connotation, of course. So those people can succeed socially, and they are privileged socially. The people in the very high upper classes who are able to buy the house in the gated community, everything, they are doing fine as well, because everything that they lack socially, they make up for with just money and resources. It's the people in the middle who are not part of this lower class culture, they're not part of the hip hop culture, but they also don't have the exorbitant amount of money to buy the house in the gated community. So they're stuck in this situation where we talk about sometimes gentrification of neighborhoods, where you have a neighborhood that's mostly black or Hispanic, and these poor white kids, these college kids, they move in and they start fixing up the place. They start painting the houses, or they start, they start playing their indie music and whatever. They start a family. And this process of gentrification is called racist because it raises the property value and it pushes these blacks and Hispanics out of the neighborhood. But these kinds of cultural processes um, are really the way that people compete, and it determines on an individual level your success, your failure, your happiness, your satisfaction in life. Because ultimately, when when you're trying to start a family, for example, and you look at an area and you can't socially compete in that area, or you don't feel safe, or you don't feel welcome, then it's very hard to conceive of wanting to start a family. Especially, I think it's for men and women. But if you talk to women, and you ask them, if you ask a woman who lives out in the countryside on a farm, would you like to have a family? I think most of the time they're more likely to say yes than a woman who lives in an urban jungle, because it doesn't feel safe. And I think there is an instinctual thing here where people, they look at their surroundings and they ask, am I going to get genetically swamped anyway? Should I even bother trying? Whereas if you live within a homogenous community, then you're merely building upon an existing structure. So I think with this tangent, I started out with basically the idea that civilization or complexity cannot enforce itself without the use of force. If everything's just a libertarian, hey man, if people like hip hop, if they like rap, let them listen to hip hop, let them listen to rap. Let's let the market decide what the best music is. If you do that, what's going to happen is base instincts of people, the animal instincts, are going to dominate the market, and you're going to create this lower class, upper class alliance against the middle. And the only way to have a middle class society with middle class norms where those are supreme is you have to use force. You have to use bullying, shaming, guilting. When people have saggy pants, you need to be Puritan about it. And basically, the Puritans constructed the ultimate middle class society, where you weren't really supposed to be too wealthy because that's usurious and that's greedy, and you really weren't supposed to act like a low class individual either. And so I think when we think of the kind of ideal utopian 1950s American society, we are thinking about an inherently Puritan society. And the society we have now is an attack from the top and the bottom against that, of, saying that Kim Kardashian or Kanye West or whatever, they're going to promote uh, animalism as an ideology. And the winners are going to be the doctors, the lawyers, the dentists on the one hand, and the gangsters and the hip hop artists and the rappers on the other hand. And people who just kind of want an average family, or they want a middle class lifestyle, or they want something that is dispersed and complex, rather than what I would say right now. We have a complex society, but it's a very hierarchically a top-down complex society rather than a dispersed network. Like the difference between an urban center where everything's controlled from the top down versus something like a pioneering, like a prairie society, the Wild West. You have little outposts of civilization. And this is not just the American Wild West, but European colonialism in general, human migration in general.
The example that parallels it most, to my mind, is the Neolithic expansion. And this rise of the middle class, there's a number of characteristics, I think, that need to be present for it to really happen. And one of which is territory, open territory, because if it's occupied, you really need that influence of the aristocratic element to subjugate the local population, and very few peoples are actually willing to full out commit genocide. Maybe the Celts were when they entered Britain, but most of the time that's not the case, and so you will have this kind of natural alliance between the high and the low against the middle, and the aristocrats will push out their own competitors from their own society in their colonial enterprise, and you get something that looks like a lot of the colonialism in Africa, where, like, a perfect example would be the English South Africans pushing against the Boers, who were more that middle class colonization event. Yeah, so you need open territory, or else that dynamic enters, and it needs to descend from a higher civilization. So the Wild West, average people in Western society, Americans that is, could push out into territories occupied by Indians and successfully defend themselves and start homesteads because of the technological advantage. Neolithic farmers, the same situation presented itself. Now, you look at something like the expansion. So I'm just going to pivot, unless you had something to conclude on your thought. I'm going to pivot to another topic related. Okay. So the expansion of the Neolithic farmers into the Indus Valley that led to first Mehrgar in Pakistan and then the rise of the Indus Valley civilization, that was an example of a top-down society. I mean, just the way that the sites remain, everything was centrally planned, and this was kind of by necessity in that climate. So it wasn't necessarily like a necessity of pushing down a local population through warfare. It was a necessity of having architects and engineers effectively design your cities to retain rainfall and keep reservoirs. So there was a natural impetus then to have that high-low alliance type of society, and this was probably the most advanced society in the world for its time, the Indus Valley. And that's an example where a highly complex society can create a cultural space in a foreign land and dominate it to the point where the indigenous Indian culture is almost irrelevant, except in maybe some places like the very southern tip of India and Sri Lanka. But even that, I mean, that's important to note. The primitive, tribal, indigenous, hunter-gatherer Indians, their religion still exists. Their way of life still exists. There are tribes that are highly representative of that kind of aboriginal Indian stock. And I've said before, if you want to look at like a snapshot of what the original inhabitants of India, and when I say original, I mean the original Homo sapien inhabitants of India might have looked like, you can look at the Andamanese. So they're probably like Negrito. But yeah, the Iranian Neolithic comes in with an advanced culture, and the peculiar geographic circumstance means that the elites of the society are able to basically monopolize power, and that Neolithic element basically becomes what we now take to be the indigenous Indians because they were so successful, that is, the Dravidians. And then the opposite, so instead of a complex society imposing a cultural space by like force, in this case it was by necessity of the environment, but usually it's by military force. Then you have a less advanced culture, the Indo-European culture, which relatively at that time, the Indus Valley civilization was in a period of decline. The civilization was basically collapsing. The Indus Valley civilization had literacy. They had massive trade networks. The Indo-Europeans, I mean, you're not looking at a consolidated movement of a civilization or representative of a civilization. You're looking at effectively nomadic bands that got together in manor buns or, warrior bands. This is the Indo-European pattern. And then like spread the franchise of sovereignty in a very distributed way, but at the cost of this kind of highly integrated, mythologically complex, metaphysically oriented system. Now, it developed into that in India. It developed into that with the Celts and all over the world because you're not dealing with an intrinsically low IQ population, and they did take from the people that they dominated. But yeah, that was an example where a higher civilization, a higher culture, Indus Valley, could not defend itself against the culture, initially against the culture of the Indo-Europeans, which was force-based. But then over the long run, there are different theories on this, but I kind of hold to the notion that yoga was practiced in the Indus Valley, and other beliefs are probably indigenous to the Dravidians, to the Iranian Neolithic, that now we take to be Hindu beliefs. And even in the Vedas themselves, by the ends of the Vedas, so the Upanishads, you already see this kind of reaction against the Brahmin, the reaction against the formalism and ritual, and more of a philosophical bent, which is that culture's way of kind of reliving their archaic, more metaphysically oriented society. And then, this is what develops. So cultures come back when you have a primitive culture come in and take over the aristocracy. You might have this aristocratic replacement. You might have the spread of those genes, but it is very hard to completely eliminate the underlying, genetic pool. And it seems like there's some sort of basic inertia. People in its native land, like they push back with what they came from originally. The Celts in Ireland, have persisted. The Welsh have persisted in large degree. What you really need, though, is a rural class, a peasant class that maintains the oral tradition, because it's probably not purely genetic, passing on this stuff. That was present in India. That was present in England. You had the folk tradition, names of places and things. Now, if we have the internet and we have the new information age, that's the only way cultural memory is ever lost. People don't forget. Peoples do not forget their heritage unless something else is imposed on top of it. So our cultural memory is overloaded by constantly pushing new information, and then the old stuff has to kind of drain out. And that's exactly what we have, which is worrying. I'm going to look at the chat real quick.
Yeah, that is, I would agree that, culture, people want to set up this dynamic where culture just evolves and cultural changes. And if you're uncomfortable with cultural change, then you're somehow anti-naturalistic, or you're against the natural way of things because things just change all the time. And that's not actually true in nature. I mean, we can look at specific biological species like the crocodile, alligator. Their basic archetype has remained stagnant for millions of years. And then we can also look at cultures of people where they've been speaking the same languages for thousands of years, the same way of life for thousands of years, hunter-gatherers and so on. So culture does not just change. In mathematics, you can look at variables in a system, how they interact, and you can look at when a system will reach a stable point. And that is true when you have a certain small number of variables, but it can also be true for a large number of variables. And that would be true for psychological cultural spaces, that you can reach a point where you've somehow come to some sort of arrangement between the genders, you've come to some sort of religious arrangement. You have a system that works and that is stable and doesn't need to change. The only reason it would be changing is if it was inherently unstable. I would suggest that something like feminism is inherently unstable. And what wants to be promoted, the narrative that is promoted in Hollywood, is that the natural thing is that new things are always transgressive, that to be new, to be hip, to be cool, and to be included, actually. The if you want to be included in the mainstream, you have to be transgressive against whatever was happening 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or your parents' generation. And it's this very I don't know how to say it, oxymoronic culture that we have, where you say to be part of the mainstream, you need to hate yesterday's mainstream, and you need to constantly complain about it,
Yeah.
which is a very unique and novel thing. I
The
can't think of any
establishment is
historical example.
anti-establishment, which is very strange.
Right. Right. So I can't think of any historical example where you would have a group of people who would say that, we hate our grandparents and our grandparents hated their grandparents. And it is the natural course of things that you always hate the previous culture. You always hate the previous genre of music. And you're always looking for this constant new thing. That's different from, say, you look at the evolution of Western music, and yeah, there were new artists and new musicians and new compositions, but each composition was not a rebellion against older compositions. Each composition was an ode to older compositions, saying we've learned from the masters and now we're trying to build upon what they've already made. Or the history of science. We only see further than our ancestors because we stand on the shoulders of giants. So it was a progressive, in the literal sense of the word. It was a progressive culture of, yes, we're evolving, yes, we're changing, yes, we're improving, but we're only doing so in a constructivist manner upon the foundations that have already been laid, as opposed to what we have now, where I think that is still happening in reality. But theoretically, the way people conceive of it is that, the 90s were a terrible time because Bill Clinton used the Confederate flag in his campaign ads, or we could think of a hundred other examples of how, or people were transphobic, or Eddie Murphy was making jokes about gay people, or something. You can find these things that were part of the mainstream then. That then they were, Bill Clinton's strategy, or Eddie Murphy in comedy, or any of these examples themselves were transgressions and rebellions against previous iterations of culture in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. So this constant, the only foundation that we seem to have is that no matter who you are, no matter where you are, the only consistency is that you rebel against the previous iteration of culture. And that rebellious factor is not totally alien to Western culture, right? You can look at Zeus rebelling against Cronus. You can look at the way that the Aesir in Norse mythology rebel against the giants. So the idea that you have like an earth cult and then a sky cult, and revolts against it. So the idea of revolution is not a foreign idea. It's not that revolution is always bad or evil or you can't have it. But typically the archetype is that you have some primitive earth cult, the sky cult comes in, and it creates an eternal reign, and that there shouldn't really be any rebellion after that. If there is rebellion, it's punished. Now we have this concept of eternal rebellion. And when we use terms like progressive, see, the way that I would like to use it is the idea that you have a foundation, you build upon it. But the way that progressive is thought now is it's this constant cycling of culture where whatever was in yesterday has to be out of fashion today. And it's progressive not in the sense of teleological progressivism of always going towards some higher goal or building up complexity, but it's a progressivism of like the laundry of, you're just going in a cycle, you're spinning in circles, you're not really getting anywhere, culturally at least. I guess things are faster. I guess communication is faster, or your email storage is bigger, or you can fit more into your phone or something like that. So everything's more condensed. The world is smaller and therefore more hierarchical and therefore more easily controlled by a central source of authority. But the people and the culture is not becoming more advanced. And so that's the contradiction where we have more technology, we have more control, theoretical control over people from the top down, but we don't have dispersed networks of culture that are more complex. They're becoming more simplistic. The language that we use and the music that we listen to and the recreation that we engage with is more primitive, more animalistic than that of our parents' generation and our grandparents and so on.
Right. I'm seeing some kind of debate about the issue of folk music and whether or not this progression is still actually happening. It looks like Tyrone in the comment section is defending the view that people want novelty, they want innovation. But, I'm going to go back to your mythological example and say that when we set up icons, when we set up these representations of universal archetypes, they are meant to perform a role, right, which is to tell us who we are. So culture is an extension of mythology, and mythology is an extension of that central metaphysical worldview. And the culture has to inform you about your place in the world. Now, that place changes because if you raise up one generation with a set of representations of archetypes, then they will raise their children in a different way. And because now they're different, like you're changing the system by virtue of observation. So there is this feedback that necessitates progress. But as the new generation comes up, modifications are made to the existing archetypical structure to demonstrate that there is continuity. It's not change for the sake of change, it's change to reflect the actual progression of this core genetic pool. There is a people, it is growing, it is learning its place in the world, and culture informs it of that place. Now, folk music is a good example, but you hit a certain point with the development of folk music, and you do see the rise of irony and breaking down form for the sake of form. And this is just kind of trailing developments in philosophy. You have Nietzsche set off the idea of criticism, basically, or make it extremely fashionable. And Heidegger, the way he treats the introduction of being in time, is also highly critical of the philosophical inheritance that he receives. And then moving into the French theorists, and it goes out of control into full postmodernism. Well, in art, we see a similar kind of development. We talked about this before, the kind of postmodern irony culture, and that the far right, the deep right, alt right, embodies that to a great extent. I'm seeing people talk about the folk music of the alt-right being this kind of critical music. But that seems to me like maybe there's a greater function here, right? Because any organism, including a centralized genetic pool, so including a nation or a civilization, has a rise and fall. Right, so the primitive archetypes of the civilization are established when the basic way of life is established. So when the technologies are brought about that enable the way of life. With Western culture, this is maybe like pre-industrial developments in trade and mercantilism and in societal organization. So basically, like maybe the Italian Renaissance stuff happening in Florence. There's a new kind of urban lifestyle that's intensely individualistic. The art reflects this, and this kind of violation of caste, which is revolutionary, is the founding act of this civilization, the Western, I guess, Faustian civilization. And that theme is retreated as the people progresses, and the archetypes tell us our place in this progression until you reach a period of senescence, where basically all that's left to do is decay the archetypes, and we're left then, like any new matter that's generated tends to be critical. People that I was just thinking this the other day, like the people that I listen to on a regular basis usually are descriptive of the past, usually are critical of power structures that exist. There's very little setting up of new mythological material. There's not a lot of this is why I have a metaphysical orientation. There's not a lot of like laying down the groundwork of a worldview, because if you're criticizing what existed, you're saying there's deficiencies, and there is, because the new culture, the new people rather, that has emerged by the end of this civilizational cycle requires a new kind of, basic founding archetype. So the senescence has to happen, basically. The critical phase has to happen. It's just that once we've exhausted all of these cultural symbols, they have to degrade to the point where they're no longer self-instantiating. They no longer, and what I mean by that is they no longer have a cultural inertia that propels things down a given track of their own accord by virtue of the prestige that these symbols have. When that's dead, when they're no longer living archetypes, all we have is like kind of raw grammatical ingredients to then build a new language, culture, and way of life. So that's how I would interpret that. I don't, I've said for a long time now, we see this cultural replacement because this culture is dying, right? And the same thing with the Indo-Europeans coming in to replace the Indus Valley civilization. This culture is dying. Our archetypes are not representative of the current situation. We don't know our place. And so it's not just the complexity of our culture, but also the fact that our culture is actually outdated. Like, it doesn't actually reflect the development of consciousness that we've seen in the last 500 years. But on a bright note, Western society, not just Western civilization of the last 500 years, has been very good at reinvigorating itself, at revolutionizing itself. Most of the time when a civilization collapses, that's it for that region of the world. There's nothing else to come. But with the West, we had Greece and Rome, and then like a death, but then we reformulated. We're good at reformulating. And we just have to do it again.
Well, I guess the direct analogy is that you had the Greeks, who the Romans perceived as more sophisticated, more civilized, more artistic, and the Romans were more militant. They were more virile, and they dominated the Greeks. And then they said, you know what, maybe we should learn from the Greeks. And they kind of adopted, those Greek forms, and they hired Greek tutors, and they tried to build upon what Greece has already done. Rome collapses, and then these virile, uncivilized, unsophisticated Germans come in, but they don't exterminate all the Roman stuff. I mean, you do have the Dark Ages, but ultimately there is a Renaissance at some point or another. They say, look, let's go back to that. Let's learn from that. And so how long does that process take? If the Germans come in the 6th century, Renaissance doesn't happen until, depending which one you're talking about, the 16th century or later. So does that mean there's going to be 1,000 years of whether it's a mestizo culture that takes over or a Muslim culture? Are they then 1,000 years later going to look back and say, hey, those people, maybe they had something that we could learn from them?
I see that happening.
I'm not sure.
If that happens.
Yeah.
Well, I think it would, because
I mean, it's obviously possible.
The European substrate will remain large, even if on the census, it may look like we're a tiny minority, but the majority of the others will have some European ancestry, right? And so, develop 1,000 years. Say, civilization collapses, the migrant hordes flood, looking for resources, and we go through a dark ages, right? Well, at the end of that, it's like what happened with in Muslim Spain. The lighter features, all of the stuff that is visually white, will still have the same selective pressure, selective reproductive preference that it has now, and those features will likely spring up again. I mean, it's important to note that the Neanderthals had diverse hair and eye colors, and then with the Homo sapien introduction into Europe, it was all dark hair. For as far as we know from the genetic evidence, it was all dark hair. They kept the light eyes somehow, but it was all dark hair all over northern Eurasia until, as far as we know, roughly like 6 or 5,000 years ago, with migrations of ancient North Eurasians into the Western Russian steppes, and then the features started to reappear. So it could happen again. That the whole whiteness thing might be like this archetype that does reoccur and might disappear and might actually come back. So that's the phenotypic aspect of it. They might like retroactively come to identify with whiteness, but they'll also just genetic testing, if they ever have that, they'll see how influenced they were. And I think other features besides just purely external ones will also maintain an advantage, but I don't want to bank on that, right? But that's something that I've thought of before. If you can consolidate and create a new mythological framework and create a coherent community that progresses through time, then if everything else mixes up, then you can always view that as kind of fodder or grist, or for the mill, I guess, to then work back into more of a coherent gene pool. There's a little bit not totally centered in what I was addressing there, but hopefully the concept is clear. I think the fact that mixing is happening is unfortunate, maybe, but it's not like the European genes aren't just disappearing. Like, European women are highly desirable. European men are highly desirable. We're not always going to breed together, it seems like, in this cultural context, especially with the imposition of urban culture and Middle Eastern culture, which is to come probably. So it's not good, but the genes aren't going to go away. They will identify with the language. They will identify with a technological tradition. The only way this doesn't happen is if something like Islam comes in and absolutely suppresses everything else and erases the cultural memory, which is what they do. And that's probably the worst case scenario. It's not that, America becomes Mexican. It's that America becomes a caliphate.
So what you're saying is that worst comes to worst, we form a mestizo alliance, a Catholic mestizo alliance against the Muslims to prevent the caliphate from taking power. I mean, I'm personally on board with that. I mean, South America is basically, a white supremacist zone. You have, like, with the exception of, I don't know, what's it, Bolivia or something, all of the countries and territories are run by white people, and so that is a place where white people can survive. The Islamic thing seems the weird thing about it is that, in a way, because Islam has interacted, like, for instance, in southern Russia you have Chechnya, and Chechens are often blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and they're Muslims. And, like, as it is today, you can look at that and say, I think I would rather be with the Chechens than be, like, with some of these Indios, like the really, like, Bolivians or something like that. And also the fact that, proximity plus diversity equals conflict. So we can look to afar, and I think in either case, people, it's obviously the people you have to deal with on a daily basis and that you have conflict with are the ones that you're going to be thinking about. So if you live in an area where Muslims are coming in and they're changing the landscape of that area and they're decreasing your social value and your social worth of your cultural norms, then you're going to be more concerned about Islam than you are going to be concerned about Spanish. Whereas if, on the other hand, Spanish isn't a big problem, then you're gonna, not view it in that way. So, in general, I guess the point here is that ultimately, whatever happens now, like the success or the failure of any political the success or failure of Trump, whether or not he's able to have a free and open internet, whether or not he's able to prevent Democrats from taking power in 2020, whether or not he's able to construct a border wall, like all of the things that we would like him to do. We don't know if he's going to be successful. If he is, great. If not, we do have a grand theory of history that perhaps in hundreds or 1,000 years, that you can reconstruct civilization out of a racially mixed population, that it's been done before, that it can be done again. And
It'll
with
homogenize.
that being said, right. It will, like India homogenizes, like we can think of a basic Brazilian type, even though Brazil is a mixed country. Like we can think of a South American type. So there will be a homogenization process, but you can still come back from that theoretically. So with that being said, um, uh, in the here and now, what we try to do is we look at our own individual lives, we look at who we are as people and the culture that we come from, and we ask, how can we as a culture compete within a space that is hostile to us? How do we create our own cultural spaces? And one of the ways to do that is religion. So if you look at so what is white culture? Like white culture is defined by blacks as nerdy. It's defined by Hispanics as uncool or like stiff, cold. Um, these are the attributes that outsiders look at white culture with, and when whites look at themselves, they use the perspective of outsiders. So they say things like white people can't jump, or white people can't dance, or yeah, white people are nerdy. They wear glasses. They're bookish. They're academic. They don't have social capital. So these are the attributes that white people look at themselves with. And one of the ways that some whites have been able to get around this is with religion. And you see some of these Christian communities, they will do the activities that are described as nerdy, or I'm not even sure how to like we could come back to the musical culture. So look at some Christian hymns, or Christian musical culture, and the values and the style of that music, and what it promotes. They are able to be nerdy, they're able to be wholesome and lame, and all that. That's how it would be described from the outside. They're able to do that and create a social space in which that is valued and viewed as something positive rather than something negative. And I think that's one of the very few ways to do that, to create a space that is insulated from a generally hostile mainstream culture. There's not a very libertarian way to compete with a mainstream that is hostile to you. And it seems like the only way to insulate yourselves is through some kind of religion, some kind of communal system where you have a common spiritual framework, you have common rituals and something like that. So when people are in the chat, they're talking about like alt-right music or something. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it Are we doing it right? Should it be different? um, I think that is never going to be able to compete in the mainstream. I don't think you're ever going to come at some like really creative alt-right culture that is going to compete against the mainstream within the mainstream space. So we have to look at every cultural artifact within its metacultural context. You can't just look at a cultural artifact and say this is good or bad. It is always as compared to what, according to what standard. And so, according to the standards of the mainstream, the alt-right will never succeed. It will never be sexier than the mainstream, according to the mainstream's definition of sexual value. So you have to create an alternative system. And the way that you do that is, through this insular communal process with rituals and a spiritual framework. And so when people say, we can't get into the religious debate because we're going to lose people, or like we're going to cause religious infighting, I understand why on the surface, from a quantitative evaluation, that makes sense. Like if you're Donald Trump, you don't want to start the Donald Trump cult or the Donald Trump religion because you're trying to get as many votes as possible in a democratic context. But in a cultural context, which is elective, you don't have to abide by those rules. So you can go qualitatively. And I think that is probably the right strategy.
It's the only strategy, it seems like, especially given the censorship that's happening. I mean, if Alex Jones even can just be eliminated from all social media with no repercussions, like there's some people, I've seen some hashtags and some things on Facebook, but there's nothing of consequence here coming about. We'll see about the Internet Bill of Rights if that changes anything, but like just project this trend. They have established their orthodoxy, the set of moral propositions that are absolutely unquestionable. If you question them, you're anathematized. They have that, and they are purging people who disagree. They have a very strong foothold in the popular culture. They're establishing the popular culture. They have the communications media themselves. Like the whole infrastructure is in their hand. Absolutely everything is in their hands. And they're doing what I think long term a small community has the ability to do vis-a-vis this kind of mixed demographic that might emerge in the future in the US. So what I mean by that is that they have a consolidated group of intellectuals who have an agenda, who have a way of disseminating a message, who have a way of changing minds, and gradually, through incremental suppression of opposition and funding of allies and, fellow travelers, I guess, all of that, the end result is that the way they want the world to progress is how it'll progress. So the mixing is happening, but they are the filter. They provide the filter for what gets through to the next generation. Mixing could be absolutely random, or it can be guided, and they are providing a guided mixing, which is intended to eliminate us, among other things, and to preserve them. That's important to note. It's to preserve that 1% who does own all the resources. And they will do the incremental suppression of reproduction of the underclass eventually. They have to. There's no other way. And that's why they push environmentalism. So they have a handle on it. But what we can do to mimic that is if you create this consolidated mythological identity, religious identity, community that persists across time, that maybe speaks another language. I saw somebody mention that in the chat. That would be a good idea. Like maybe all of us learn Latin and speak Latin. Maybe have churches that do services in English to like provide that filter. But anyway, have a core that's protected from the mainstream culture. And you can have cores within cores and have filtering processes where the absolute center is the idealized aesthetic, is the idealized moral preferences, is the idealized man. So the archetype kind of converges with the physical at that level. And then allow, with the marital laws, with the way that you set up community organization and law, have this replacement effect that you saw in England in the 11th century and on, and in the North Sea area, have that aristocratic or center out demic expansion to then like gradually set the filter for how the mixing occurs. So hopefully that was clear. What they do is the same kind of thing. It's just their ideal is ultimately materialistic, pragmatic, and nihilistic. And they believe in kind of like this very abstract technological progress where like the existence of the human is not really relevant to them. Like they basically fall into Faust's trap. They are the inheritors of the Faustian power structure, and they fall into Faust's trap where they don't care if they're damned if it means they can know absolutely everything. So they'd rather have robots exploring the universe than have humans living on Earth, because expansion, I guess, which is their telos, progress and expansion. But we can do that. We can if they fail, which they have to. They're going to fail. It's an anti-life way of being, and their mythological structures are vampiric. They're parasitical. They don't create archetypes. They don't create living mythic structures. They criticize, and they are feeding on the senescent matter of our civilization, which, yeah, it's theirs too, but they're eating themselves effectively. And the end result of that probably will be this: either Islam takes over the world, or everyone in Western countries, in advanced countries, is just mixed up. That is barring like what China decides to do at some point. China might just come in and sweep up if we don't get our act together. That's also possible. anyway, we kind of like have to have faith in the elites at a certain level. Like, I hope they remain strong enough to allow China not to take over the world. Like, maybe before they go, they can take care of China or something. But yeah, I think if the rest mixes, having this core means that we then can set the filter on how the mixing takes place. And even if we go down to like 1% of the global population, even if our ideals, our archetypes are rare, if they're endangered, they can always come back. They do come back. They do come back in history. So you got to take the long view.
Yeah, I think it's I don't think it's out of the question. I mean, what do I know about science or the progression of technology? But I think it's not out of the question that robots basically take over and they start exploring the universe or something. And whether or not I can prevent that, or whether it's personally desirable or aesthetically desirable for me, it's kind of, I mean, it would be like, I mean, the way I view it is like, would the dinosaurs prefer to be replaced by mammals, or would they prefer that dinosaurs continue ruling the earth? So, from that third person perspective, I don't really focus. I don't view it as something relevant to my life, but I see like the question of the cultural spaces, and are we going to succeed as individuals, and then do we at least have a template where, you have something like a civilization where I mean, honesty, I think, is an important factor to this. So you have a system that relies so heavily on lower classes and lower class ideals, and promoting animalism, promoting hedonism. And it does that because on some level it's weak. It's dishonest. It has to distract people with bread and circuses. Because if you were just honest to people and you said, "Look, here is the reality of things," then uh, they would be so miserable that they wouldn't fear to lose it. They wouldn't fear to lose much of anything, and they would be very prone to revolt. So when you make people materialistic, when you make people bourgeois, they're less likely to upset your system. Whereas, when people are more spiritually oriented, then what they're looking for is truth and honesty. And we have a system where, yeah, you tell people that this is what is valuable. Your physical appearance is valuable to such an extent, or your hedonic experiences are so valuable. That's what life is about. YOLO, you only live once. You tell them that, and then you don't tell them that when they're old, they're going to look back and be, very upset about how they've spent their life, how they've set up their life, and how that's not really a sustainable way of living. So, I mean, that's kind of my concern: is, are we being honest in the moment? Are we being honest about the future? Are we being honest about the course of civilization? We can describe these things and analyze them, and then try to apply what we know in our daily lives. But the way that things are set up, my main concern isn't whether we're going to have space robots or how people are going to be genetically modified, but it's basically, are we being honest about that, and are we being honest about the daily facts of life? I mean, as another example, the idea that people are spending millions of dollars to extend their life from age 80 to 81, or the entire idea that the value of life, or our advancedness as a society is determined by, is the average lifespan 75 or is it 80, as opposed to, what is the quality of the life lived, as opposed to the number of years that you've lived it, or the number of parties you've gone to, or how drunk you got at the party, or something like that. So I think that kind of honesty, the ability to step back, the long time horizon, the low time preference, that's kind of what I'm valuing right now.
Right, which is what you have to vet. I think it's the same thing that I was really talking about by saying that they're progress and expansion oriented. What I'm saying is they're materialistic and quantitatively oriented rather than qualitatively oriented. And there is a metaphysical assumption that leads to that, which is the assumption of materialism. So they believe in the material world, and that's their central flaw, I think. So that's why, again, religion is the only way to address this. And as far as like, why should I care about the future of the world, the material world, demographically? Because I have to live in a way such that the world that my being participates in is headed in a trajectory consistent with my highest aesthetic and moral ideals. And there's a Kantian axiom that you live by the maxim that you would have universalized. So I have to contribute to the world in a way that approaches what I would like to see. And just allowing everything to go to crap, and I believe in reincarnation, that's part of my metaphysical presupposition, or at the very least, my afterlife will reflect my conduct here. That's universal. If my conduct here dismisses the future of the world, then my future spiritually will not be good, because I'll find myself more likely than not in a world filled with beings that do the same kind of thing, that is, neglect their duty to the greater system. But it's a fine line between caring about the world because that is living consistently with your value, and caring about the world for the sake of the world, for the sake of the matter, for the sake of the robots exploring the galaxy, right? That's kind of the fine line. They don't tie in necessarily, or many of them don't, the spiritual relevance. Or maybe they do, because their spirituality is somehow this kind of, again, Faustian turn within the perennialist system. Because, yeah, a lot of them are perennialists, technically speaking. They're not traditionalists in the sense that they want to preserve the old archetypes, in the sense that they view the cycling of history in terms of the yugas, in terms of the decline of the ages. They can be progressives, but still be perennialists. They can be anti-traditional and still be perennialists, because they share some of the metaphysical presuppositions about the ultimate divinity of the ultimate self, which is a fine concept, and it's a subtle concept. It's deep and subtle, and it's easy to corrupt. And I think they've corrupted it. That's what goes on there. So hopefully that clarified a little bit what I meant by, they have the wrong kind of preferences. But yes, as far as how you live, that has everything to do with you living up to your aesthetic ideals. Has to do with you mastering your own will, and to that extent, right, the way that you impact the world has to be, in a sense, self-directed. Why do you want to create this community? Not because it's going to last 1,000 years, but because it's going to improve you, right? It's going to improve the individual. And I saw that somebody asked, what about grassroots? We talk at a relatively high level of erudition and abstraction often. So, what do we expect from people at the base? Things don't really grow up from the base. Mythological elements are transformed. They're kind of churned over by the grass. But that material has to be eaten by a higher organism. It has to be digested by a higher intellectual organism. And it's from that level that then order descends to cultivate the garden of the grassroots. And yeah, so I don't expect anything from the bottom. But, once you have your schematic ready, then you attempt to use the bottom, rally the bottom. It's funny because the high-low versus the middle is, in one sense, negative in terms of power dynamics. Because what happens is that freedom-oriented, individual-oriented middle class is cut out by a degenerate underclass and a selfish elite at the materialistic level. But there is an idealistic parallel that's good, that you want the highest IQ people, the highest level of spiritual attainment, all of them cooperating with the common person. So this is like religion. This is the Catholic Church. You have the highest level clergy celebrating the bottom and not celebrating the selfish, materialistic, power-seeking middle. Basically, the the priest caste is there to keep the warrior caste in check by celebrating the working class. So in that sense, you can use the grassroots, but without that intervention, that superordination from above, there just nothing happens. I'm going to read, I see myself mentioned in a comment from Nordisk Nationalist, so Nordic nationalist. You're going to talk so much that you forget all about the ultimate goal, or maybe not. I don't even know what that is, even though I've seen Erval's earlier vids. Fine, then say it. Oh, wait, I think I was mentioned because he was talking to somebody else. But yeah, talking too much and not taking enough action is definitely what we've done. Not taken, and the kind of action that we've taken is going places to talk publicly. It's like not the right idea, people. It really bothers me because I've been saying for like 6 years that the only way forward is building the alternative. You cannot change the power structure that exists. You cannot reform this civilization. You can build the alternative that will outlast it. And that's the only thing that you can do. That's the minoritarian strategy, and it's been what I've celebrated from my first days on YouTube. I just didn't do it for any racialistic reason at all. Not that it's for a racialistic reason, it's more like I've fit the understanding of race that I now have and its spiritual role into my like deeper worldview. But yeah, for the people who just criticize, for the people who just talk and narrate on contemporary politics and cultural shifts, what are they doing? What is their ultimate goal? They're kind of relying on this grassroots. There's like an expectation that's going to lead to something. But I feel like YouTube may just exist in an ultimate sense to release our energies so that we don't do something. Like maybe this is just a funnel, or rather like an outlet to prevent anything more substantial. But still, they can fine-tune it and allow more or less. And if the spigot sends out too much and it's going to flood the culture they're establishing, then they can always tighten it. Maybe not all the way. Maybe that's why they don't just ban us all. But yeah, gradually turning it down. And by that point, the tank's empty. All of these nationalist energies. I guess we could read more comments unless you have something to say at the moment.
The dynamic between action and talking, the way that I mean, it's difficult because you can imagine a scenario in which like everything is banned, like Alex Jones is banned, everyone's banned, we're banned. There's no outlet for this kind of discussion, and it's just sort of a very private feeling that you have at the end of the day where you have no one to talk to, and you say, well, yes, everything's messed up, but if you don't have any way to express that, I think it starts to express itself indirectly. And so instead of walking around and understanding specifically and clearly why everything is the way it is, you just have a general malaise or a general dissatisfaction or a general anger. And then that redirects perhaps into your personal relationships or your work life or something like that. And so I think there is a benefit to being specific and to like understanding exactly what's happening and to talking about it. I think there is a benefit, or at least I perceive a benefit, in allowing, let's say I'm trying to destroy the alt-right, I would still allow a certain amount of freedom of speech, because to ban it all at once, you want to boil the frog rather than light it on fire, right? So you don't want people to wake up and figure out, like, as has been done in South Africa, they are now looking at passing legislation to take land away from white farmers. But you'll notice they're not talking about taking away property from white celebrities or white business owners or white professors or anybody else. There's a lot of rich white people who live in South Africa, and they will do fine. And that's why they don't care about this confiscation law, because it really only affects farmers.
The
So
Anglo
the
War on the
farmers are
Boer
specific
is still
farmers.
going on. It's still the
Yeah,
Anglo War against the Boer,
yeah, yeah.
which is sad.
So, right, that's pretty obvious to anyone who knows the history of it, and it's but they've done it piecemeal, right? When Mandela came to power, he said, "We're not going to have any retribution. We're not going to try to have revenge. We're just going to start from ground zero, have a meritocratic society." Now, obviously, he was a communist, so he was lying through his teeth, but that was the message that was put out to the mainstream. And since then, it's been progressively getting worse and worse and worse. And there is a certain kind of white elite in Africa. There is a kind of Chinese elite in Africa who is doing well and will continue to do well and is not negatively affected by these kinds of laws. And it is, again, we can repeat ourselves and say it's the war of the top and the bottom against the middle. And yeah, that's how it's going to progress. So I'm glad that we can have these conversations. I think it is beneficial for people to understand ourselves at this high level, so that we can speak. Then you can then distill these ideas in simpler ways and apply them in more, I guess, primitive ways in daily life. Like if we can talk about civilizations and understand the way that civilizations rise and fall, then you can also look at your own lifespan as a little mini civilization, and you can see the kind of things that are the kind of habits and the kind of people you surround yourself with, and how that's going to influence you. The culture that you take in, the music that you listen to, so your activities. If you understand how these larger systems, more complex systems work, then I think you can apply that to your own life and improve yourself in that way.
Yeah, fostering understanding is a big benefit of this kind of unregulated discourse, the media driven architecture of power in the dissident right, which I'm against still. It does raise awareness, right? It shifts the Overton window. But so Tuath makes a comment that I think we all forget that around 10 years ago, we were at the point where we couldn't talk about these things. Now there's some pushback because it's become common, not necessarily a bad situation. I think what happened there was that they miscalculated with the internet. They released this utility at the peak of egalitarian ideology, the mid-90s. So that was the all-time peak of egalitarianism, and they kind of assumed, because any nationalist attempts in Western nations had been so pitiful in the decades prior to that, and getting worse and worse as time went on, they just assumed the energy had fizzled out and they could safely release this, and probably was going to be released sooner or later anyway. This technology existed. So the internet ran its course. The social experiment was run, and they started to see that a certain way of thinking, our way of thinking, rose to the top on a lot of these platforms. Like, I'm still shocked that when I go to random YouTube videos, now my selection of what videos I view is obviously skewed, but even non-political videos that I watch on YouTube, when I go to the comments, there's always people of our way of thinking. Always. So these, and any news site, if you go to the comments, it's people with our mentality who often show themselves, demonstrate themselves, whether that's, again, a selection effect based on the kind of person in our way of thinking, whether they're more likely to comment on things, who knows. But they saw this and they have adjusted accordingly, and the censorship is what they're doing. Now, they controlled media from really from way back, but especially from the late 40s up until the mid 90s, right? Total media control. Where were you going to publish alternative information? There was just no alternative. And they were successful from the 40s to the mid 90s. Egalitarianism and anti-nationalist sentiments, egalitarianism rose and anti-nationalist sentiments rose as well. I'm losing my grammar here. But now they're correcting. They released the internet, they ran the experiment, and they're realizing they have to do it again, and they're trying to. If they succeed, then the only alternative is the minoritarian strategy. Now, if we have some genius that we don't know about who invents an altogether new communications framework that is open to the public, that is absolutely a free speech arena, then maybe this kind of grassroots populist movement could, in theory, occur. But that's not the situation on the ground. That's not the battlefield. You can't idealize to fight in the kind of battlefield you'd like to fight in. No, the infrastructure is there, and we're fighting down these channels and not this idealized kind of space. Now, on that note, what is necessary is a communications framework. We can't create something like the internet. We can't create an absolute alternative, or even like social media. Like, all of those fail pretty sad. Maybe they're going to rise, maybe they will. But when I go on BitChute and look at half of the videos are far right dissident, and any normal person who goes on that website will know immediately that this space is not okay. This space is not for me. And Gab is the same way, where you offer complete free speech on the internet. So I was just listening to somebody that said that, it's a myth that this, allowing this far right discourse actually scares people away. I think that may be a myth on YouTube. People aren't going to stop using YouTube or stop using Facebook because one of their friends or one of the people one of the videos they saw on the recommended list has a far right bent, but they will not go on marginal platforms for that reason. I mean, it absolutely will scare people away from alternatives. So yeah, the problem with the media-driven platform is that the media is shrinking up, so we can't just change hearts and minds. We can't rely on that. But at a more fundamental level, the communications network has to shift. That base level understanding is useful, right? And it has a certain role to play. It's necessary as a precondition for a higher level of integration of a social organism. We need to move from this kind of basic language space of common sense understanding into formalized systems. And once you have formalized communications networks, you can get into cybernetics and an actual organism emerging, a political organism, a religious organism. But people in a room just talking does nothing. And that's a lot of the reason why some communes, egalitarianism communes, fail, because they don't set guidelines on discourse. You need to funnel your energies. And if you have a network of communications that sets specific objectives, and it sets your obligations, it sets your responsibilities and benefits of, you want incentives for people to rise through the structure. You want to tell the best people, if you're capable, yes, we want you in leadership. And you want them to want to assume that responsibility. Responsibility is responsibility. I mean, it's work. That's why you need to provide incentives. So those two characteristics must be present in an alternative communications framework that we must develop. That is that the roles are formalized, you know what your obligations and your rights are, and you have to provide an incentive for people to want to get to the top. Now, I have my own ideas on this, but that's why I'm really not just satisfied with, let's just talk about things. And it's better to do it at a higher academic level, right? It's better to operate at that level and change those minds and maybe establish consensus in a narrow way, in a limited sense. But no, what we need is the cybernetics. We need the series of connections and defined channels of communication.
It's also good, I think, if you're working toward a goal, no matter what that goal is, even if it's like a game, for instance, a video game, it would be better, I think, if people were, instead of just talking about things, if they were also, I think there at some point have been alt-right Steam groups or something, people can play games together. If you're cooperating in that way, you're encountering, and I don't think video games are really the best way to do this, but it's probably the most simple hedonistic way. uh, if you're working toward a goal and you're encountering problems and obstacles, you're just not talking about ideas in the abstract. That brings in a deeper, like a personal aspect to it, where it's not just, okay, can this person manipulate words in a conversation? Can they, come up with discursive ideas? But can they actually confront problems and work together in an organic hierarchy? So you're good at this, you do this. You're good at that, you do that. And that specialization that takes place, people learning how to fit themselves within organizations generally. Um, Maybe if you like know people, try to get a job at the same company or the same corporation. And if you even just have two people, if it's not even a small business, even if it's a large chain, like, and you're working within teams, and let's say there's 20 people and you're just two people, you now control 10% of that team. So there's an institutional benefit to that in theoretical long run. Like, you could help each other get promoted, and then you could make decisions in how who new people are hired, and so on and so forth. But on an immediate level, learning how to work together with people in an organization for a defined purpose um, is an important skill that I think people should be working on rather than just getting together and talking.
Yeah.
So
So
whether it's work or like,
are you announcing our new Fortnite clan? Is that it? That's
I
what I'm
haven't
gathering
played
from this.
Fortnite. I've
Neither have
Yeah,
I.
well, I mean, it's interesting because I've had experience with that. Not Fortnite, but just generally the way that, those kind of online gaming communities come together, and you do get these organic hierarchies of personality types where certain people want to lead and certain people want to follow, and how do you get those things done? How do you get people to show up on time and everything like that? So there is something like, just start somewhere. It can be that simple. I mean, that I think is appropriate for people who are like 12 years old, 14 years old. Maybe when you're an adult, you should strive for something higher. But yeah, definitely getting something done. I mean, even if it's as simple as, we're going to go on a hike through the woods, that still, you have to get people there on time. You have to be wearing appropriate hiking clothing. You have to get from point A to point B. Maybe you bring water. Like obviously that's not the end goal of where you want to take this, but it can start with simple stuff like that, bringing it into the real world, because then it's all those, like when you talk to some of these people. I was listening to some kind of debate. I don't know who these people are, but I remember when internet blood sports was big, and the live streams and people going back and forth. It's like, okay, yeah, you can um, use specious argumentation, or you can just tell people that their arguments are wrong, or like you can have this like very unproductive argumentation back and forth. But if you actually put these two people in a room together, who would actually dominate the art? Like, when you have two audio devices and they're both just competing for airtime, that's one thing. But when you have two people head to head in a room, you will see who actually has the conviction of their ideas. You can see it in the posture, you can see in the way they orient themselves. Jordan Peterson, I think, is a good example of someone where he can just kind of blather on for a while, and people are like, huh, this guy kind of sounds smart. Maybe I should listen to him. Maybe I'm going to buy his book. But all the debates, except for the ones with feminists, for some reason, he seems to be very good with women specifically. But all the debates I've heard or seen with him that are with other men, he always takes a submissive role. He always is like, well, I'm sorry for, having these ideas, but maybe they're kind of right, and don't hurt me for having these ideas or something. So, like that, I think that level of things, the interpersonal level, that's not just purely an abstract expression of ideas. That is something important that people should be working on when they think about, what activities can I do to improve myself or to improve the movement. It would be going in that direction of organizing, not around necessarily the exchange of ideas. Because I think at the end of the day, we talk about a lot of stuff, and it's more the orientation. I mean, it's who we are, It's what our culture is. It's where we came from. It's what we're comfortable with. Like we can't necessarily change that at the end of the day. Um, we could try to become these totally disassociated individuals. But at the end of the day, people are familial creatures. Like we have families, and we have a childhood, and hopefully we would like to pass on some kind of childhood onto our offspring. That requires a culture, because I discussed earlier, having an urban, cosmopolitan, individualistic, globalist thing, that is not a childhood. That is a horror show. I mean, look at what happens to child actors. Okay, child actors, the Burger King Kids Club or whoever they are, these people are raised in a globalist culture. They are raised to have no culture. They are raised to be like anything. They're actors, right? You don't have a personality. You have whatever personality the director tells you to have. And these kids, their life outcomes are very, very poor. Like their psychological health, the rates of child abuse, all of that, it's a very bad scene. So obviously, we don't want that for our children. We want a homogeneous culture for our children. And the question is, how do you create that? So, one idea: go hiking. Go hiking with your friends. Start there.
Yeah, and a virtual alternative is an interesting notion. So, of all people, Daspook is suggesting that VR may be the solution to this question. Maybe not a game, but maybe some kind of virtual space where you can set virtual objectives, maybe information-based objectives. Now, I've actually thought of this before, using VR, like a particular VR platform, to have a virtual academy. Like, you don't need the VR to do this, but I think it would definitely enhance the experience and keep people interested in coming back for more. But yeah, that's interesting. That's my own personal inclination as far as how do you set defined objectives. You can set information-based objectives in an academic sense, in that you can put out tests, put out a grading scheme, put out requirements for educating others, put out incentives on that basis, and then you can also set objectives for propagandization. And it's all possible. This is what I'm working on. And I brought up some slides. We could go over really quickly. I don't have too much time left here, but we could look at those. Just my basic suggestion. So I think I'm going to do that. Give me just 1 second. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking of. But anyway, you have to define this level of specificity. Individual connection nodes, who is talking to whom, and what are their obligations. Now, I did this. I don't think I'm going to go with this organization. Oh, okay. It looks like Ken might have been cut out when I tried to change something there. Not sure. But anyway, I'll just explain this very briefly. I'm not currently using this model. I'm building something better. But this is just what I wrote out for a group on Discord that I suggested this might help them. This is based on IQ. And if you set positions in a hierarchy based on IQ scores, IQ is the best social metric that we have. You can put 1 through 5 here, and 6 through, 15 here, randomize these groups, and then set obligations to talk to 2 people beneath, and you have 1 supervisor above. If a new person enters, you have to define how the hierarchy is shifted. You can read all this, but I just want to get people thinking in terms of the level of specificity that's necessary. And I think it's important also that people talk to each other, even when they don't necessarily want to. We have to get people talking to each other of their own level of cognitive ability, and also at others. So you have to define how you modify positions within a hierarchy like this. You can go ahead and pause it if you're watching on replay or whatever and read it. I'm not going to go all through it, but I think this model would work that I listed here. The only problem that I really found with IQ is that it'd be very easy to falsify your results. And it's just not the best. I have an alternative ranking mechanism that's kind of like a modified democratic system where you have people with a peer-based kind of evaluation where once you evaluate your position vis-a-vis the others by a rank vote, like who do you think was best and this sort of thing, people with the most votes elevate to the top of the system. Well, then you recursively reevaluate the votes, adjusting for how many who got the most votes in that first round. So I think if you applied something like this on the basis of a weekly obligation, like a presentation of a topic, then you could establish this kind of rank order that you need. I'm doing it with IQ here, though, and I think it'd be good to be able to use something like IQ. Maybe if you actually got people past a certain point, incorporate it, maybe in the upper echelon, get these people to go and take Mensa tests. That would also get you into Mensa, and you'd network with intelligent people from your community. So that would serve another auxiliary benefit. Define your efferent signals, moving away from center and your afferent signals or your feedback. Any successful system requires feedback. So you need a feedback mechanism. A feedback mechanism. And let me just move through to the last ones. Define your duties. So here I have like you're talking with your group in a group chat at a certain point. You're talking to your superior one time in a week, and you need to at least like talk about the original efferent signal. So one of your obligations is to provide the feedback on the efferent signal coming from the highest group. Now this isn't a monarchical system. This is an oligarchy, I suppose. And that's just because there's a lot of room for abuse when you just have one person in charge, unless that person actually owns the physical resources. So a monarchy makes sense because the person at the top is permanent and their genetic destiny is interwoven with the fate of the community. So they have a strong incentive to govern well. Whereas if we let one person come to the top of a hierarchy like this that's electronically based, they very well could have been some kind of agent. So this is, you've seen all the slides now. This is one model. I think it would work, and something like that is necessary. I'm building my own. I'm building my own model now. I'm not sure if I might have messed up the audio for Ken though. I hope I didn't. Do you want to test it out and then let us know if it's not working? I can hear you. Does the chat hear Ken? Does the chat hear Ken? I'm waiting for somebody. Just let us know. I know there's a little bit of a delay. Let us know if Ken's still silent. All right, 1 second. Let me just change a setting. I know. There it is. Somehow your bar on OBS got slid all the way down. So everyone can hear you now. But anyway, I don't know if you were able to actually read any of that, but what are your comments on something like that as the basis for a communications network that's simultaneously a hierarchy, that simultaneously is able to be leveraged to achieve specific objectives? Oh, wait a second. I guess they still can't hear you. Yeah, they should be able to. I mean, I don't see why they wouldn't. Or maybe you're just very quiet. Am I very quiet as well? Okay, no sound for... This is great. I had to end fairly soon anyway. Can you hear anything? Can people hear anything? Okay, I'm not quiet. I'm good, but you're quiet. I don't understand then, because I can hear you just fine. Yeah. So these things happen. We were about to wrap up anyway. Maybe we can use this to segue to a future episode where we can talk about the communications network. And yeah, somehow the slides messed up the audio. I don't know why. But anyway, thanks for watching. Go ahead and give it a like if you haven't already. And we'll see you, if not next Saturday, then sometime soon.